Oh,
Oh, that's arts in music theory. And so this is her senior project presentation. So for her presentation, she did a combination PowerPoint presentation, which we're going to see, and paper, which she dropped into chat if you are joining us and haven't gotten a chance to do that yet. So this is her senior capstone experience. And Autumn, take it away.
Alrighty. So I decided to do my senior theory project on the importance of Ave Marias written by women composers throughout history. When trying to decide what we were going to do for my senior theory project, Teresa and I talked about looking at Irish or German composers because that's part of my heritage. And then that just never worked out. And eventually we were just listening to the really famous Ave Maria by Schubert that everybody knows, which kind of led us down this path of like, oh, I wonder if there are any other Ave Marias out there, which kind of led us down this rabbit hole. So I just want to talk really quickly about how, what the whole presentation, what my whole project's about, and how I'm going to go through everything. When trying to put together a thesis statement, I couldn't quite just put it all in one little concise sentence. So here's my thesis paragraph for you all. Most prominent women composers throughout history have written an Ave Maria or other song to the Virgin Mary, which tend to be prominent pieces within their repertoire due to the harmonies, melodies, and the tonalities they decided to use. The way these pieces are composed highlights the prominence and importance of Mary as a woman in the church, and maybe trying to highlight the virtues of all women with her. Most modern women composers continue this tradition and continue to compose settings of Ave Marias that treat the text with simple but pronounced reverence. This paper, through in-depth musical analysis, will set out to show how these women composers have written Ave Marias to show the importance of women and how these compositions are important for women in the past, present, and future. When putting together all the various pieces I could find, I found quite a few, and how I decided to present them all to you today will be in chronological order. As you can see, I was able to find quite a few. However, I will not be talking today about the Alice Tegner piece, which is the 1913 piece, as well as the Regina Whitmire, which is the 2020 piece, just because I could not find scores for these pieces to analyze. So first is Hildegard von Bingen, kind of the first lady in music that we read about in most music textbooks. She was an important nun. She wrote lots and lots on theological doctrine and medicine, and of course music. She wrote many pieces, over 73 in total, and she compiled these all into one kind of book. And in this book, she categorizes them such as songs for the saints, songs for the Virgin Mary, songs for the sick. And she does a very interesting thing with the ordering of these pieces. As you can see in the title, her section is called The Father and the Son, the Virgin Mary, and the Holy Spirit. That's because in her compilation of all her pieces, she does this interesting thing where she groups them as songs for the Father and the Son, songs for the Virgin Mary, and songs for the Holy Spirit. So she still has the Holy Trinity in there, but she inserts Mary right in the middle, which is a very interesting thing to do. Not quite in line with doctrine, but not quite out of line with it as well. Right here, I have an example of it. This example is probably the most virtuosic of the entire piece. As you can see, it's got quite the range, much larger and outside the usual octave that would have been usual for the times. This example specifically is talking about Eve with puffed up pride, but and then contrasts it with how humble Mary is. And I'm going to play this example for you really quickly. As you can hear, it's quite outside of the norm for her time period. So it's very interesting that she does this specifically with a Marian piece. In fact, the first of her many Marian pieces that she wrote. Why is the music? Oh, there we go. Next up, we have Barbara Strozzi. Definitely not a name that you hear in the music textbooks very much, if at all. When doing some research about her, I found out that she tried to be quote unquote an official composer, very published, very active within the academic world. She tried to attend many academic meetings and many times was chastised that she could not do this. And in fact, many slandered her name, calling into question her virtue and chastity, because she did have a couple of children outside of wedlock. And while researching her compositional style, I found that one of the key aspects of her composing style was word painting. She does a lot, most of her pieces include some aspect of word painting. And so I expected to find that here, and I found it here, but not quite in the way that I was expecting. So on the left, we have the verses. As you can see, she's got quite the range. It goes from that G to the C within 3 measures. It's quite the run. And in that verses, she's talking about how beautiful Mary is, how just pretty she is, how wonderful she is to look at. And then on the right, I have the refrain. As you can see, it's a lot more compact, definitely not the that soaring run that's in the verses. And on the right here, the text is talking about the accomplishments of Mary, what she can do, all the amazing things she does, how she can pray for us, how she can intercede for us, how she is the new Eve, how she helps just helps us be better people. And I thought this was interesting that she puts so much emphasis on how beautiful Mary is, but very little emphasis on all the wonderful things that she can do, considering that in her own life, she was outcast for trying to do important things. And so I think she's using the text painting here that she's very well known for, but she's kind of doing it in a reverse way. She's doing it with a little bit of sass. She's saying, oh, look how pretty we are. Look how pretty Mary, and in contrast, I am. And here are all these wonderful things that we can do, but you don't really care about that. You really only want to hear about the pretty stuff. So she's doing her usual text painting, perhaps, but with a little bit of sass. So I'm going to play the 2 examples I have up here on the screen for you. And now for the refrain. Yeah, so you can hear how the verse is talking about how beautiful she is are more virtuosic, whereas the refrain, it's like, oh, let's get through how all the things we can do really quick so we can get back to the really pretty stuff. Alrighty, next we have Isabella Leonarda. She was a very prominent nun for her time, and I have titled her slide The Example. As we go on to future composers within this presentation, we'll see how many of them mimic many of the things that she does. If I were to describe her musical style without all the fancy musical terms we'd have, I'd probably say traditional hymn style. You walk into a church, it's exactly what you expect to hear. Using the fancy musical terms we have, it has a lot of homophony, it's very modal, it's very syllabic. I'm going to play an example for you, so that way you have it in your ear as we go on and listen to some of the other composers. So at the end of the example, it does go into a little bit of polyphony, but for the most part, it does use mostly homophony. It is very modal and it's very syllabic. Next, we have the two big names of women composers that we have in textbooks, sometimes the only two, but the real big ones that you see and that you know about. They're the official Ave Maria prayer that we kind of know and is formalized within the church was not really formalized until before their time. And so it a little bit before their time. And so they weren't as familiar with it. It wasn't as well known. So instead of deciding to set specifically the Ave Maria prayer as we know it, they have both decided to set different poems about the Ave Maria. And it's the subject matter of the poems that they've chosen is very interesting. Both of the poems they have decided to set are specifically about asking for consolation, asking for help, a child asking their mother for safety and comfort, especially with the tragedy they faced and hardship they faced in their lives. Clara Schumann couldn't pursue composition officially because when she had her family, she had to take care of her children. And then after the early and tragic death of her husband, she had to perform and make sure she could provide for her family. And Fanny Hensel wasn't allowed to go after composition as her brother was. I have a quote in the paper. I don't have the specific words, unfortunately, in front of me, but the quote goes from her father, who tells her that music is a very pretty ornament to have, but it should not be the basis for your being and doing. So they both could not pursue music as much as they would have. Up here, I have an example specifically of Clara Schumann. The first two verses that I have there on the left correspond with the text in the example, and the second two are other examples from the text elsewhere in the piece. And you can kind of tell how the text and the person speaking or singing the text is trying to find consolation within Mary. And Fanny Hensel's is specifically more about a child asking their mother for help and consolation. I'm going to play a short snippet of this for you. If it will load, hopefully. Alrighty, next we have Laura Netzel. She was a Swedish composer. I've titled her The Bridge Between Modern and Traditional. So Clara Schumann and Fanny Hensel were both of their compositions. I didn't include analysis for them within this presentation just because there was nothing that quite stood out. They're both very lovely pieces, of course, but they were very much common for the time period they wrote in, very contemporary for their time period. So there was nothing outside of the normal. And Laura Netzel does that. As you can see on the example on the left, she has borrowed chords, she has 5 ofs, she has 7s, very contemporary for her time period. However, she also pays homage and respect to a more traditional hymn sound. She has a pseudo-plagal cadence there. It's not the true 4-to-1 religious ending that we all know and love, but it's still a predominant to 1, and it gives you that the same feeling. So I'm going to play both examples for you here. So just very of her time period, beautiful and lovely, and exactly what you would expect to hear within that time. And then we have her homage to the more traditional. Alrighty, moving on, we have Rebecca Clark. I looked at a great deal of modern composers. I was able to find quite a few modern composers who had written and composed Ave Marias. All the other modern composers that I had the chance to look at are all still living. Rebecca Clark was the only one who had passed, so she gets her own slide. And I've titled her Focus on Common Practice. So if you look at her example that I have up here really quickly, and then we kind of switch back to Isabella Leonarda, the examples look very similar. They have the homophony, it's modal, super syllabic, and I'm going to play the example for that I have for you, and you're going to hear that traditional hymn sound. All right, so once again, take a second to look at Isabella Leonarda, and then we're gonna flip right to the modern composers. And it's all extremely similar. It has a lot of homophony, super modal, super syllabic. In fact, one piece that I looked at was entirely modal. There was not a single leading tone in it except for at the very, very end. So I'm labeled them all Leonarda 2.0 because again, they mimic that common practice, traditional hymn style. I'm only going to play one of the examples for you, but if anyone has a dying wish to hear both of them, I will gladly play both of them. Kind of again, if you walked into a church and you heard that, it wouldn't seem at all out of place. Very, traditional hymn sounding in that aspect, which leads us to me. When trying to decide how I wanted to compose my own Ave Maria to go with this project, I found that I had a foot in both camps. I'm of course a modern composer. I'm still living last time I checked. And I of course love that common practice style I grew up listening to. I'm Catholic and I go to church every week, and that's the style that I'm so used to listening to and hearing. But also on the other foot, I in some ways feel closer to the more historic composers because they were more likely to be heavily involved within the church, maybe have a greater devotion to Mary, know just the scripture and the story of Mary more. So I decided to do a bit of both. On the left, I have that common practice style, more homophonous, modal, syllabic. And then on the right, I have my homage to the historic style where Hildegard or Strozzi was more likely to do what was outside of the common practice music of their time period. It's definitely not too crazy, but it is outside of my usual writing comfort zone. And now I'm going to play it for you. And that's kind of my piece within this larger repertoire. And then my last slide, I just wanted to talk briefly about my hypothesis about why some of the differences I found, specifically how the more historic composers were more likely to go outside of their comfort zone, like the Hildegard and the Strozzi, just do something very, very different from their time period. And then whereas the modern composers were more likely to do that traditional hymn style. And my hypothesis is that for the historic composers, they were more constrained by society. They had less ways to express themselves. The church itself played a bigger role in their lives and society in those times. And they just had fewer female role models to look up to and exemplify. Whereas the modern composers, we definitely have less societal constraints. We can own property, we can marry whoever we want. In the church as a whole, it just plays a less important role in society, and we have more history than they did. So naturally we have more female role models that we can look up to and exemplify. So for the historic composers, being able to express themselves with music was very important, and then finding this very specific woman within the church and exemplifying her was very important to them. Whereas for the modern composers, they have other people to look up to and exemplify. So perhaps specifically writing a song for the Virgin Mary would not have been as important to them as it was our historical composers. And that is my presentation, and I'm open to questions. If there's none, that means I did good, right?
I'll have some once I read your paper.
Yeah.
I was just curious, just one thing I noticed in your chronological slide. Did you run into any historical reasons, or did you think about why there was a 400-year gap between the first two composers of the pieces that you found?
I tried to find compositions of that time period, and I just couldn't. And my only guess is that the farther back we go, the harder it is to just find like firsthand sources, find stuff that's still preserved. And Hildegard's stuff is so well preserved just because she did a lot inside and outside of the church. So she's just more likely to have some things published, and you have one thing published, the more likely it is to you have more and more of your work published. And so I think that's why there's such a gap. Hildegard, we have a lot of, just because she was such an important composer. And then we get into the age of printing, and things become more accessible, and there's more just documentation.
I thought it was great how you used Hildegard von Bingen as your like first source, because like she's the one like who kind of introduced opera almost, and it's amazing that that's kind of the beginnings of that whole style.
Yeah, thank you. I looked a little bit into her entirety of her music, and she has a play, I think, called Ordo Virtuum or Vordidium, and it has, while I was researching, I found it has 83 unique melodies in it, completely different from the rest of her work, which is very interesting.
I'm curious, and looking at some of the more contemporary works, were there settings that were more modernist in the musical vocabulary, or not really? Was that something that just doesn't really exist very much?
The 2020 piece, the Regina Whitmire, which I mentioned I wasn't able to look at just because I couldn't find the score for it. I have an appendix attached to the paper at the very end that you can read, and it has links to the recordings of all the pieces. If you go ahead and listen to the recording, it sounds much more modern than the rest of the compositions. Again, I wasn't able to like sit down and analyze it, so I couldn't see how different it was, but it was the most contemporary, being 2020. But hers was the only one that really kind of like if I sat down at a church and I heard the Regina Whitmire one, I'd be like, huh, that was an interesting decision on the music director's part. But all of the other ones, I go into a church and I'm like, oh, I'm not thinking twice about it. It's exactly what I expected to hear.
Do you think there's something about the text or something about the composers that that drew them in that direction?
I was able to reach out to a few of the composers and ask them a couple of questions. And both of the ones who I reached out to and were able to get back to me, both said that they only decided to set an Ave Maria because they were commissioned to by a women's choir. So they specifically didn't go and seek out this text and choose this text like the more historical composers were. So I think they were like, their thought process was perhaps, oh, here's this traditional piece or this traditional prayer or hymn. Let me write a traditional prayer hymn song to go with it.
Did you wind up with a favorite version of all of these that you heard and listened to, or a least favorite version if you want to go there? It's okay, you're among friends.
I really enjoy the Clara Schumann one. Just the romantic, all the romantic pieces in general are always my favorite. I like the text of the Clara Schumann one, the one that she chose to set just really feels close to me. I like the tonality she used. I like the Laura Netzel one, the Swedish composer we looked at. I also really enjoy the Alice Tegner one, which unfortunately I was not able to find a copy of. My least favorite one is probably the Regina Whitmire, just because the most modern one, just because, again, I'm Catholic. I grew up going to church every week. I'm used to that traditional hymn sound. And so I didn't, not that I disliked it, but it definitely wasn't my favorite setting of the text.
Any last questions for Autumn? Okay, well, Autumn, thank you very much. We've got your paper that we all can take a look at. And then I've also asked Autumn to send a copy of her Ave Maria to the faculty separately. It's a little, there's some, composers don't always like to share their music to everyone in the public. So she'll be sending that to us so that we can take a look at that along with her paper. And then the way this process works, for those of you that are curious, we take a look at the paper, we come up with other questions for her, a little more in depth after we've read the things, and then she has a defense of her project and her paper next week during finals week. The faculty, Chris Keelan, David Farrell, and myself will get together and with Autumn and grill her and have her defend her project and her paper, and then she'll be all done. So thank you everyone for participating in this and for being an audience, and hope those of you that are not in the state are happy and well, and we'll talk to those of you in the state very, very soon. Don't forget, portfolios are due on Friday.